In 1886, the United States Army had 5,000 soldiers in the field. They were spread across 2 countries, hunting one man. That man had fewer than 40 people with him, women and children included. The greatest military power on earth had been chasing him for a quarter of a century. They never caught him. He walked in. He chose his terms, sat across from a general, and agreed to stop. What happened next, what America did with that agreement, is the story almost no one knows. His name was Geronimo, and this is the war that made him. The Apache did not always live in the Southwest. Their ancestors came from the far north, Athabascan-speaking peoples, whose original homeland stretched across the subarctic regions of Alaska and western Canada. Somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 years ago, they moved south, and they kept moving until they found a land that suited them perfectly. That land was vast. The territory the Apache came to call their own stretched from the high plains of what is now Colorado down through Arizona and New Mexico and deep into northern Mexico. The Spanish called it La Gran Apacheria, the Great Apacheria. It was one of the largest indigenous territories in North America. It was also one of the most formidable. Soaring mountain ranges dropped into scorched desert floors. Deep canyons cut through stone that no road could follow. Springs appeared and vanished without warning. To an outsider, it was hostile and impenetrable. To the Apache, it was home, and they knew every inch of it. The Apache were not one people but many. The Chiricahua, the Mescalero, the Jicarilla, the Western Apache. Each band occupied its own range, spoke its own dialect, and followed its own leaders. They did not gather into large armies or build permanent towns. They moved, camped, and dispersed, organized into small, tight, deeply loyal family groups that could vanish into the landscape at a moment's notice. This was not weakness, it was strategy perfected over centuries. The Apache understood something that every army that ever fought them would eventually learn. A people who cannot be fixed to a place cannot be defeated in the way that settled peoples can. You cannot besiege a camp that is gone by morning. You cannot starve a people who know how to live off land that offers nothing obvious. Apache society was built around the raid. Not war in the European sense, not armies meeting on open ground, but swift, precise strikes for livestock, supplies, and captives, carried out by small parties who struck fast and disappeared into terrain their enemies could not follow. To the Apache, raiding and warfare were distinct things. One was economy, the other was honor. The first outsiders to discover this distinction were the Spanish. When Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led his expedition into the Southwest in 1540, the Apache were already there, already established, already formidable. For the next 3 centuries, the Spanish tried every approach: military campaigns, peace settlements, ration systems, and formal treaties. None of them lasted. The Spanish eventually hit on something that worked, partially. They began supplying the Apache with the goods directly: rations, trade goods, and older firearms distributed through colonial presidios. It was an arrangement that acknowledged a simple reality. The Apache could not be beaten outright, so they could be managed. For a time, the arrangement held. Then Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, and everything changed. The new Mexican government inherited the Apache problem without the Spanish treasury to fund the solution. The ration system collapsed. The Apache, suddenly deprived of what had become a reliable source of goods, resumed raiding on a scale that alarmed the entire northern frontier. Mexico responded with military campaigns, bounties on Apache scalps, and massacres of Apache camps. The cycle accelerated, and it did not stop. It was in this world that a boy named Goyakla was born in 1829, near the headwaters of the Gila River. He grew up knowing the Mexican frontier as a place of intermittent violence, raids and reprisals, truces and betrayals, but also as something navigable. His people had survived it for generations. He had no particular reason to believe they would not survive it still. Roughly the same age as Goyakla, and a more prominent figure in the Chiricahua world at the time, was a man named Cochise. The leader of the Chokanan band of the Chiricahua, Cochise was tall, powerfully built, and possessed of an authority that even his enemies would acknowledge. He was a man of war when war was required, and a man of diplomacy when it was not. He was also, in the late 1850s, making a careful effort to be something that no Apache leader had successfully been before: at peace with Americans. The Americans had arrived in numbers after 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo handed the entire Southwest to the United States overnight. Apache land, by the stroke of a pen in a Mexican city, had become American territory. The Apache had not been consulted. No one had asked them anything. But Cochise watched the new arrivals carefully, and in the late 1850s, he reached a pragmatic conclusion. He allowed the Butterfield Overland Mail to run its stagecoaches through Apache Pass unmolested. He supplied the station with firewood. He kept his warriors clear of American travelers. It was a peace that was working. It would last until February of 1861. In October of 1860, a raiding party struck a ranch near Sonoita Creek in the Arizona Territory. They drove off a herd of cattle and took the rancher's 12-year-old stepson. The rancher's name was John Ward. He rode straight to Fort Buchanan and pointed his finger at the Chiricahua Apache. He had no evidence. He had a direction of travel and a conviction. The post commander assigned the case to 2nd Lieutenant George Nicholas Bascom, 24 years old, freshly graduated from West Point, and newly arrived in a territory he did not know. Bascom was described by those who knew him as a fine-looking fellow and a gentleman. He was also, by most accounts, a man who did not yet know enough to understand how much he did not know. Bascom took 54 soldiers and rode east toward Apache Pass, a narrow gap through the Dos Cabezas Mountains and the only reliable water source on the road between Tucson and El Paso. It was Chiricahua country, and it was also where Cochise kept his camp. On February 3, 1861, Bascom arrived. He sent word that he wished to meet. Cochise came. He had no reason not to. He had worked alongside the Butterfield mail station at Apache Pass for years. He knew the Americans there by name. He brought his wife, his young son, his brother Coyuntura, and 2 nephews, not a war party, but a family. He walked into a tent under the assumption that he was meeting a fellow man of business. Bascom accused him of the kidnapping. Cochise denied it. He told Bascom plainly that he knew nothing of John Ward's son, that the raid had not been his band's work, and that if Bascom gave him time, he would make inquiries and help find the boy. Bascom told him he was a liar. Then he ordered his soldiers to seize everyone in the tent. What happened next took only seconds. Cochise drew a knife, slashed an opening in the canvas wall of the tent, and ran. He was shot at as he went. He reached the hills. His wife, his son, his brother, and his 2 nephews did not. They were held as hostages. The word that went out to Cochise was simple: return the boy and the cattle, and your family will be freed. Cochise did not have the boy. He said so. He sent messengers saying so. He asked Bascom to conduct a simple exchange, his family for any American Bascom wished to name. Bascom refused every approach that did not begin with the return of a child Cochise had not taken. The negotiations went in circles for 16 days, and the circle narrowed with each pass. In those 16 days, Cochise took hostages of his own, a stagecoach station manager named Wallace, and 3 Americans pulled from a passing wagon train. He was trying to build a position from which a trade could be made. He sent word repeatedly that the Americans would be treated well. He asked again for the exchange. Bascom refused again. Reinforcements arrived for the army. With more soldiers came less reason to negotiate. The walls closed in. Cochise, realizing that no trade was coming and that his family's fate was already decided, had his American captives put to death. When the soldiers found them, led, by some accounts, by the circling of vultures, Bascom ordered his response. Cochise's brother Coyuntura and 2 nephews were executed. Bascom had given his answer. Cochise's wife and young son were released. The Apache Wars had begun. The boy Bascom had come to recover was never found. He had been taken by Coyotero Apache, a different band entirely, and grew up among them, eventually becoming a scout who would help hunt down the very people falsely accused of taking him. His name in adulthood was Mickey Free. History has a dark sense of irony. The pattern set at Apache Pass in those 16 days in February 1861 would repeat itself, with variations for the next 25 years. An American representative arrives. An Apache leader comes in good faith. An accusation is made or a promise extended that turns out to be a trap or a lie. The Apache respond. The Americans escalate. The pattern is not incidental. It is the mechanism of the entire war. Within weeks of the hangings, Cochise had joined forces with his father-in-law, Mangus Coloradas, the paramount leader of the Mimbreño Apache, a man of enormous physical presence who stood well over 6 feet and had led his people against Mexican encroachment for 30 years. Together, they were a force that the entire southwestern frontier had no answer for. They struck everywhere, and at once. Wagon trains, mining camps, ranches, and relay stations along the Butterfield route were hit in rapid succession. Within 2 months, approximately 150 people were dead, and large sections of the Arizona Territory had been effectively abandoned. Gravestones appeared along the roadsides bearing the same inscription, "Killed by the Apaches." Then the Civil War erupted. The Union pulled its troops east. The Army's attention, such as it was, turned to a different war entirely. The Apache had the territory almost to themselves. It was not peace, it was absence. And absence, in the logic of the frontier, would eventually end. It ended in the summer of 1862, when General James Carleton marched 3,000 California volunteers east through Apache Pass. Cochise and Mangus Coloradas were waiting for them in the high ground above the spring, the only water for miles. The Apache held an almost perfect position. They were driven off only when Carleton brought up howitzers and began lobbing artillery shells into the cliffs. Neither side had encountered that combination before. The Apache learned something important that day about what they were now fighting. Mangus Coloradas was wounded in that engagement. He survived, but the wound aged him, and by the following January he had made a decision that speaks to either the depth of his exhaustion or the depth of his faith in human decency. He would go to the Americans. He would talk peace. He came to Fort McLean in January of 1863 under a white flag of truce, alone, unarmed, escorted only by 12 warriors who waited outside. General Joseph Rodman West received him. West gave his orders to the sentries that night in plain language. He made his intentions known to the sentries in plain language. Mangus Coloradas had evaded every soldier command for years, and West wanted the matter resolved by morning. Mangus Coloradas was provoked through the night. When he moved, the sentries acted on their orders. The official report said he was trying to escape. The soldiers buried him outside the camp. The following day they returned and removed his remains. His skull was prepared and sent east, first to a phrenologist in New York, then reportedly to the Smithsonian Institution. It was sent east, first to a phrenologist in New York, then reportedly to the Smithsonian Institution. The Apache believed that a man who went to the afterlife without his head could not enter it whole. Mangus Coloradas, the greatest leader his people had known, would wander incomplete forever. To the Apache, what happened to Mangus Coloradas was not simply an outrage. It was a statement of intent. Every leader who had walked toward the Americans under a flag of truce had been punished for it. Cochise's family had been seized at a peace parley. Mangus Coloradas had been murdered at one. The white flag, to the U.S. Army in the Arizona Territory in the 1860s, was not a guarantee. It was a tool. Cochise understood this. He had understood it since February of 1861. He retreated into the Dragoon Mountains, a maze of shattered rock and hidden canyon that had sheltered his people for generations, and began a war of attrition that would confound every military commander sent to end it. Was patient, precise, and utterly at home in terrain that the Army found impassable. He did not need to win battles. He needed to make the cost of the war too high to continue. For the better part of a decade, he succeeded. A young warrior in Cochise's orbit watched all of it. He had been present at Apache Pass on the night of the Bascom confrontation. His campfires were among those burning in the hills while Bascom soldiers fortified the stage station below. He had known Mangus Coloradas. He had watched both men try, in their different ways, to find a way to live alongside the Americans, and he had watched both be answered with the same thing. His name was Goyacla. The Mexicans called him Geronimo. He was paying attention. The pattern had been established. The war would run for another 23 years. And the engine of it, the mechanism that drove every escalation, was not Apache aggression. It was a specific and documented sequence, a promise extended, a promise broken, and a people who had learned, at great cost, that the only response was to never stop moving. Before Geronimo becomes the story, the man who set the terms of the entire conflict must be fully understood. Cochise outlasted his enemies not through savagery but through intelligence, and the final chapter of his war, the one that ended not with defeat but with a negotiated peace, is as extraordinary as any battle he fought. The Dragoon Mountains rise out of the southeastern Arizona desert in a sudden chaos of granite. Boulders the size of houses stacked on top of each other, canyons that open without warning, ledges that overlook approaches for miles in every direction. The army officers who tried to pursue Cochise into this country described it as impenetrable. Cochise described it as home. For 11 years, it was his fortress. From 1861 to 1872, Cochise conducted one of the most sustained guerrilla campaigns in American military history. He did not hold territory. He did not mass his warriors for open battle. He moved. He struck at isolated ranches, supply trains, and military patrols, then pulled back into the rocks before a response could be organized. He could be everywhere and nowhere, and he understood the arithmetic of the war he was fighting better than any general sent to stop him. The arithmetic was simple. The Americans needed the roads open, the mines working, the ranches producing. Cochise needed none of those things. He needed only to make the cost of holding the territory too high to bear. Every burned ranch, every abandoned mine, every convoy that turned back, these were not just tactical victories. They were economic arguments made in fire and silence about whether the Southwest was worth what it was costing. The Civil War had stripped the territory of its garrison. When the Union recalled its troops east in 1861, Arizona was left with almost no military presence. Cochise and Mongas Coloradas took full advantage. By the end of that year, the Butterfield Overland Mail, the vital communications link between the Mississippi and California, had shut down entirely. Arizona was functionally ungovernable. Settlers abandoned their homesteads and left behind only their dead. When federal troops returned in 1862, they came in numbers. 3,000 California volunteers under General James Carleton, marching east to secure the route to Texas and root out Confederate sympathizers in New Mexico. Cochise and Mongas Coloradas met them at Apache Pass, in the high rocks above the only reliable spring on the road. The position was nearly perfect. Apache warriors above, soldiers below, and no water for miles in any direction. The army brought howitzers. The heavy artillery shells that burst against the cliff faces above the spring were something neither Cochise nor Mongas Coloradas had encountered before in that form. Warriors could absorb rifle fire, could move through musket range, could vanish before cavalry could close. They could not absorb explosive artillery in enclosed terrain. The Apache fell back. It was the first thing they had encountered they could not outmaneuver, and it taught Cochise something he would never forget about the limits of terrain. The battle wounded Mongas Coloradas. He survived, but he was aging. 6 months later, he walked into an American fort under a white flag to talk peace and was murdered that night, as Act 2 described. The Great Alliance was over. Cochise was now alone, and the war he had been fighting alongside his father-in-law became entirely his own. What followed was a decade of asymmetric war that the U.S. Army had no doctrine to address. The standard playbook, find the enemy, fix the enemy, defeat the enemy, assumed an enemy who held ground and could be cornered. Cochise held nothing and cornered no one. He operated across 2 countries, moving freely between Arizona and the Sierra Madre in Mexico, where American soldiers had no authority to follow. The border was his most reliable advantage. Every military commander assigned to the territory tried the same approaches: build more forts, extend the patrols, cut off the water, burn the food supplies. None of it worked, because Cochise's people needed only what the desert itself provided, and they knew the desert in ways that no map recorded. A soldier who lost the trail at a canyon mouth simply lost it. The Apache on the other side of that canyon had been watching since dawn. Then, in 1867, something happened that no military operation had accomplished. A civilian walked into the Dragoon Mountains alone. His name was Tom Jeffords, a tall, red-bearded male contractor from New York, who had lost 14 of his riders to Apache attacks in 16 months and had decided, with a logic that everyone around him considered suicidal, that the only way to solve the problem was to go and talk to Cochise directly. Jeffords left his weapons behind. He rode in unarmed. Cochise, who had received every American approach for 6 years as a threat, received this one as something different. A man who came to you without weapons, in your own stronghold, was either a fool or someone who respected you enough to place his life in your hands. Cochise chose the second interpretation. He gave Jeffords his time. They talked. Jeffords left alive, and the male riders on his route were, from that point, left alone. It was an extraordinary thing, not a peace, not a treaty, but a personal compact between two men who had each decided the other was worth trusting. In a war defined by betrayal on one side and vengeance on the other, it was an anomaly. It also planted the seed of something larger, though neither man could have known it then. By 1871, Cochise was in his mid-60s. He had been at war for a decade. His people had fewer warriors than when they started, and the pressure was not diminishing, it was increasing. General George Crook, the most capable Indian fighting officer the Army had yet sent to the territory, had taken command in Arizona and was systematically working through the Apache bands one by one. Cochise was not afraid of Crook, but he understood what sustained pressure, applied without relent, eventually did to a people. President Ulysses Grant had dispatched General Oliver Howard, known as the Christian General, a deeply religious man who believed that Native Americans deserved honest treatment, to negotiate peace in the Southwest. Howard understood that no one could find Cochise but Jeffords, and that Cochise would meet no one but a man he trusted. In October of 1872, Jeffords led Howard deep into the Dragoon Mountains to the stronghold itself. Howard arrived without soldiers. That decision alone was significant. Cochise had spent 11 years watching what happened to Apache leaders who came to the Americans in trust. An American who came to him without an armed escort was making a statement he understood. The negotiations lasted 11 days. They spoke through Jeffords, who knew the language and the man. Cochise's terms were not complicated. He wanted his people to live in their own homeland, the Chiricahua Mountains, the Dragoon Mountains, the land they had always held. He did not want the distant, barren San Carlos reservation that had been proposed. He wanted Jeffords as his agent. He wanted the soldiers to stay inside their fort. Howard agreed to everything. A reservation of more than 3,000 square miles was established by executive order in December of 1872. Cochise kept the peace. Every day of the remaining 2 years of his life, he kept it. He held his warriors back from raids that some of them wanted to carry out. He maintained the arrangement against pressure from both sides, settlers who wanted the Apache gone, and warriors who saw the reservation as a slow surrender. He did it because he had made his word to Howard and because he believed, for the first time in a long time, that an American had given his word honestly in return. He died on June 8, 1874, in his stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains. The cause was an illness that had been consuming him for months, most likely stomach cancer. Tom Jeffords was with him at the end. At dawn, before he died, Cochise asked Jeffords if he thought they would meet again in the next world. Jeffords said he did not know. Cochise said he believed they would. Then he died. He was buried somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains. Only his family and Jeffords witnessed it. They chose a hidden place and left no marker. The precise location of his grave has never been confirmed, and his people have never revealed it. He disappeared into the mountains he had spent his life defending, and the mountains kept his secret. The peace he had constructed lasted almost exactly as long as he did. 2 years after his death, in 1876, the federal government dissolved the Chiricahua Reservation. The reason given was administrative, a cost-cutting measure by the Interior Department. The land Cochise had been promised as his people's home in perpetuity was closed, and the Chiricahua were ordered to San Carlos. San Carlos was everything Cochise had refused. A flat, arid, malaria-ridden strip of desert along the Gila River, it had no resemblance to the mountain homeland the Chiricahua had held for centuries. Apache bands from different regions, old enemies in some cases, were crammed together on insufficient land with insufficient rations. disease spread quickly. The Apache word for San Carlos in time would become something close to a curse. Among those watching the reservation dissolve was a warrior who had been present at nearly every turning point in the war Cochise had fought. He had stood in the hills above Apache Pass on the night of the Bascom confrontation. He had ridden with Mangas Coloradas. He had watched Cochise build his piece and seen it dismantled 2 years after the man who built it was in the ground. Was Chiricahua. The Mexicans called him Geronimo. He was 47 years old, and everything he had witnessed since 1851 had been teaching him the same lesson. That lesson had started in a trading town in Mexico called Llanos in the spring of 1851. Geronimo was 21 years old. He had a wife named Elope and 3 young children. While the men of his band were in town trading, soldiers from the Mexican state of Sonora surrounded their camp and struck without warning. When the men returned, they found their camp destroyed and their families gone. Geronimo's mother, his wife, and his 3 children were not among the survivors. He sought out Mangas Coloradas and asked to join a war party against the soldiers responsible. Mangas agreed. In the battle that followed at Arispe in Sonora, Goyacla fought with a ferocity that made the Mexican soldiers call out to Saint Jerome, Geronimo, as a kind of desperate prayer. The Americans who later heard the story assumed it was his name. It was not his name. It was what his enemies screamed at him when they had no better answer for what they were facing. He kept it anyway. For the next 25 years, he had watched every attempt at coexistence end the same way. He had watched Mangas Coloradas walk into a fort under a white flag and be murdered. He had watched Cochise spend 11 years in the field and then negotiate an honorable peace that was dissolved 2 years after his death by a man in Washington who had never been to Arizona. He had watched the pattern repeat so many times that it had ceased to be a pattern and become simply the nature of the arrangement. And now the reservation was closing, and the soldiers were coming to move his people to San Carlos, and Geronimo had 30 years of evidence about what happened to Apache leaders who trusted what American officials told them. About half the Chiricahua complied with the forced removal. The rest did not. They crossed into Mexico, into the Sierra Madre, and the war that Cochise had spent the last years of his life trying to end began again. The man who would lead it had never sought a chief's title and did not hold one by birth. He was a medicine man and a warrior who had drawn his own conclusions from everything he had seen. He was the last man the Apache Wars would produce, and his war was about to begin. San Carlos was called Hell's 40 Acres by the people forced to live there. It sat a flat, rocky strip of desert along the Gila River in east-central Arizona. Land chosen, observers noted at the time, because no white settler would want it. The elevation was low and the heat was punishing. Malaria arrived with the summer floods. The rations were insufficient and routinely stolen by corrupt agents before they reached the people they were meant for. Bands that had been innocent for generations were crammed together on the same ground with no say in the arrangement. This was not a reservation in any sense that resembled the word. It was confinement without trial, imposed on people who had signed no agreement and violated no law, administered by officials who treated the funds meant for their welfare as a personal income stream. The Apache who ended up at San Carlos were not defeated people who had accepted terms. They were people who had been placed somewhere against their will and told to stay. Geronimo stayed, briefly. He crossed into Mexico when the reservation closed in 1876 and stayed there until 1877, when he was run down by the reservation's Indian agent and brought back in chains. The agent was named John Clum. 26 years old, possessed of considerable energy and no small amount of ambition, who had built a functioning Apache police force from reservation men and used it with precision. In April 1877, he surrounded Geronimo at a reservation in New Mexico with more than 100 Apache officers, seized his rifle, and put him in chains without a shot fired. John Clum was the only man who ever captured Geronimo. He resigned his post 3 months later, disgusted by the corruption of the system he had been asked to run. When Clum left, his replacement released Geronimo from the guardhouse and told him not to leave the reservation. Within a year, he was in Mexico again, raiding south of the border, staying clear of American territory, living the way he understood. The Army blamed him for every raid in the Southwest, whether he had conducted it or not. His name had become shorthand for Apache resistance in the territorial newspapers, accurate or not, and the legend that would eventually outlast the war was already forming around a man who was, at this point, simply trying to survive on terms he had chosen. He returned to San Carlos in 1879, voluntarily, on a promise of protection. He tried to make it work. He farmed. He kept to the boundaries. For 2 years he held to the arrangement. Then in August 1881, the Army moved to arrest a White Mountain Apache medicine man named Knock A. Del Clyn, whose spiritual teachings were drawing large Apache gatherings at a time the Army found threatening. The arrest went wrong. A battle erupted. Apache scouts mutinied against their own officers. The medicine man was killed. The Battle of Cibecue Creek sent tremors through every Apache band on the reservation. What it demonstrated was specific and alarming. The Army was willing to move against Apache spiritual leaders, Apache gatherings, Apache ceremony itself. The arrests that followed swept up warriors who had nothing to do with the confrontation. Geronimo watched the pattern he had seen since 1851 repeating itself in a new form. He did not wait for the next step. In September 1881, he left San Carlos with approximately 70 warriors and drove south for Mexico. For the next 2 years, Geronimo and Nana, the old Warm Springs Apache war chief who had survived the death of Victorio and continued fighting at an age when most men could barely walk, operated out of the Sierra Madre with about 80 fighters between them. They raided on both sides of the border, struck ranches and mining camps and military patrols, and moved at a pace that left pursuit columns days behind before the soldiers knew which direction they had gone. The Sierra Madre was their sanctuary, steep, forested, threaded with canyons that closed behind you, impossible to navigate without knowledge that the Apache had and the Army did not. In April 1882, Geronimo did something audacious even by his own standards. He led a raid back into the San Carlos reservation itself, not to take livestock but to extract people. He forced Chief Loco, who had counseled peace and chosen to remain at San Carlos, to bring his people out. Whether Loco came willingly or not, the result was the same. Several hundred more people were removed from the reservation and driven south toward Mexico, with Army units in pursuit the entire way. Geronimo had recruited reinforcements from inside enemy territory, in daylight, under military observation, and successfully withdrawn them into Mexico before a coordinated response could close the road. It was at this point that the Army changed its approach, and the change came in the form of one man. In 1882, General George Crook was returned to command in Arizona. Crook had fought Apache before, in the 1870s campaigns against the Western Apache, and he had developed a respect for his opponents that was unusual for the era and genuinely informed his strategy. He understood that large columns of cavalry moving through open country could not find Apache fighters who had no interest in being found. He knew the answer was Apache scouts. Men who thought the way their quarry thought, read the same terrain, and moved without the noise and dust that announced a regular column from miles away. Crook rebuilt his scout force methodically. He was blunt with the Apache he recruited. He was asking them to hunt men who were their relatives, their former neighbors, sometimes their friends. Some refused, enough did not. The Apache scouts who served under Crook were among the most effective soldiers the United States deployed in the entire Apache Wars. Not because they were coerced, but because Crook treated them as soldiers, paid them soldiers' wages, and listened to what they told him. The Army's political leadership in Washington was uncomfortable with the arrangement. Crook did not care about their comfort. In 1883, a deserter from Geronimo's band in Mexico offered to lead Crook to the hidden camps in the Sierra Madre. Crook moved immediately. On May 1st, he crossed the border into Mexico with 42 cavalry soldiers and nearly 200 Apache scouts, the first time an American army had penetrated that deeply into Mexican territory with the permission of both governments. The expedition was designed to be fast, light, and quiet. No heavy supply wagons, no bugle calls, no columns of dust visible from the ridgelines. The scouts moved ahead of the soldiers. That was the entire point. Captain Emmett Crawford's scouts found the first camp. The Apache in Cochise had believed themselves unreachable, had organized their entire survival around the assumption that no one could find this place. They were wrong. The scouts who arrived at the edge of their camp were people who knew exactly what they were looking at and how to approach without being heard. The camp was scattered before it could organize a response. Within days, every major band in the Sierra Madre had sent word that they were willing to negotiate. Geronimo came in. He sat across from Crook in the mountains and talked at length about his grievances, the broken promises, what he needed in order to return. Crook found him difficult and not entirely honest about his own conduct, but also, underneath the performance, genuinely exhausted. The man across from him had been at war, on and off, for 30 years. Crook offered terms. Geronimo agreed. Over the following months, the Apache bands came in one by one from the Sierra Madre. Geronimo was the last, arriving in April 1884 with approximately 80 Chiricahua. The army had found the unfindable. The Apache Wars looked briefly like they might be ending. The year that followed was the quietest Arizona had seen in a decade. For the first time in at least 10 years, not a single Apache raid was recorded in the territory in 1884. Geronimo and his people were settled near Fort Apache at a place called Turkey Creek, mountain country, cooler and more forested than San Carlos, closer to the land they knew. He farmed, he kept livestock, he stayed. The army officers who watched him closely noticed that he was more settled than they had expected and more watchful than he ever appeared to relax. The tension was structural. Crook's arrangement with the Apache at Turkey Creek included compromises that his superiors in Washington had not been consulted about and did not approve. The Interior Department and the War Department had been arguing for years about who held authority over Reservation Apache, and the argument had never been resolved, only suspended while Crook managed the situation with a competence that made the argument less urgent. That suspension would not hold indefinitely. In the spring of 1885, two pressures converged. The Army had prohibited Tiswin, a traditional Apache fermented drink, and the physical discipline of wives, both of which Geronimo and several other leaders regarded as profound intrusions into Apache custom and private life. The prohibition on Tiswin was not trivial. It was woven into ceremony and social life and had been practiced for generations. Being told by a military officer what they could and could not do in their own camps was, for men who had spent decades fighting precisely against that kind of control, an instruction they found impossible to accept. On the afternoon of May 17, 1885, Geronimo and another leader named Mongus spread a rumor through the camp. They claimed that Lieutenant Britton Davis and an Apache scout had just been killed and that the Army was about to respond with force. No such killings had occurred. The rumor was invented. But in a camp already stretched tight with grievance and suspicion, it produced exactly the effect intended. Warriors who had no particular desire to leave suddenly believed they had no choice. That night, Geronimo Naishi, the youngest son of Cochise and hereditary chief of the Chiricahua, Nana, Chihuahua, and approximately 140 people slipped off the reservation and drove south into the dark. By morning, they were gone. Lieutenant Davis, who had not in fact been killed, rode after them with Apache scouts and could not close the gap. Within days, Geronimo's band had crossed into Mexico. Crook set his entire machinery in motion. 3,000 men, 200 Apache scouts, coordination with Mexican forces across the border, and the pursuit that followed was the largest military operation the southwestern frontier had yet seen. It produced, for months, almost nothing. The band moved with a speed and precision that left the Army perpetually reacting. In the first weeks after the breakout, Geronimo's people covered hundreds of miles, raiding for horses and supplies, striking isolated ranches, and then dissolving into the landscape before any organized response arrived. They crossed the border multiple times, into Arizona, into New Mexico, back into Sonora, sometimes within days of each other, forcing the Army to keep forces spread across an impossible area with no reliable intelligence about where the band would appear next. In November 1885, a Chiricahua warrior named Ulzana led an independent raid into New Mexico that illustrated the Army's predicament with brutal clarity. Ulzana had approximately 11 warriors. Over the next 6 weeks, they covered 1,200 miles through some of the most rugged country in North America, killing 38 people, capturing and riding to death 250 horses and mules to maintain their pace, and returning to Mexico with a single casualty. Army units tracked them throughout. None caught them. The official count of the raid's movements was documented by the same army that had been unable to stop it. Crook's scouts found Geronimo's main camp in the Sierra Madre in January 1886. Captain Emmett Crawford led the strike, the same Crawford whose scouts had broken open the mountains 3 years earlier. They hit the camp hard, scattered the band, and captured the horses. For the first time in 8 months, the Apache were on foot in unfamiliar country without supplies. Crawford called for negotiations. They would begin the next morning. That night, Mexican soldiers arrived at Crawford's camp. They believed, or claimed to believe, that the Apache scouts in Crawford's command were hostile fighters, not American auxiliaries. In the confusion that followed, shots were fired. Crawford moved forward to stop the shooting and fell. He never recovered. He died days later in Mexico, the man who had come closest to ending the campaign honorably, twice over. The man who had come closest to ending the campaign honorably, twice, was dead in Mexico at the hand of soldiers from the country he had crossed the border to work alongside. Lieutenant Marion Maus took command and managed to establish contact with Geronimo's band. A meeting was arranged for March 1886 in a dry canyon in Sonora called Cañón de los Embudos. Crook arrived personally. A photographer named C.S. Fly was present. The photographs he made that day are the only surviving images of a Native American hand leader still formally at war with the United States. Tired men in a dry canyon, talking carefully across a distance that had nothing to do with geography. Geronimo agreed to surrender. He said he was tired. He said his people were tired. Crook offered terms. Return to Florida for 2 years with his family, after which the Apache would be given a reservation in the Southwest. Geronimo accepted. The band began the journey north toward the border. For one day, it looked like the Apache Wars were over. That night, someone brought mescal into the camp. By the following morning, Geronimo had convinced himself, or had been convinced by those around him, that the terms would not survive the border crossing. He had accepted surrender before and watched the terms dissolve. The fear was not irrational. It was the pattern. In the dark before dawn, he took 20 warriors and 18 others and walked back into the mountains. Crook reported the escape to Washington. The response was contempt. General Sheridan telegraphed Crook to say that negotiating with Apache and relying on Apache scouts had failed, that only unconditional surrender would be accepted, and that Crook was to deliver precisely that. Crook replied that he had negotiated in good faith and could not go back on terms he had offered in good faith. Told him those terms were not authorized. Crook, who had come closer to ending the Apache Wars honorably than any officer before or after him, resigned his command on April 1, 1886. He was replaced 11 days later by General Nelson Miles. Miles and Crook were opposites in almost every relevant way. Crook had built his career on understanding the people he fought. Miles had built his on the scale of his victories and the reach of his own reputation. He looked at the Apache problem and saw a logistics problem, a matter of numbers and communications, rather than a human one requiring human understanding. His first act was to dismiss Crook's Apache scouts entirely. He did not trust them, did not want to need them, and considered the strategy of using Apache to fight Apache an embarrassment to the institution. In their place, he deployed 5,000 soldiers, a quarter of the entire standing United States Army, across Arizona and New Mexico. He built a network of 30 heliograph stations in the mountains, mirrors that caught sunlight and flashed coded signals from peak to peak across distances of 40 miles or more, creating a communication web that could theoretically track movement across the entire theater within hours. On maps and in his reports to Washington, the system looked formidable. Against an enemy who moved at night, it was largely decorative. The arithmetic of the campaign was the same arithmetic Crook had described to anyone willing to listen. Geronimo had approximately 38 people with him, not all warriors, not all adults. Against them 5,000 soldiers, 30 heliograph stations, a system of supply bases, and coordination with 3,000 Mexican troops across the border. The force ratio was something approaching 200 to 1. 6 months into Miles's campaign, it had produced nothing. The Apache moved at night, changed direction without apparent pattern, used trails the Army's maps did not record, and knew every water source across 200,000 square miles of territory the soldiers were still learning to navigate. A cavalry horse needed water every day. Apache warriors could go far longer. A supply train was visible from any ridge for miles. The Apache carried what they needed. The heliograph stations went dark when the sun went down. The Apache moved after dark. Through the summer of 1886, the chase continued. Geronimo's band raided in Arizona, crossed into Sonora, struck ranches in New Mexico, and evaded every pursuit. Reports reaching Washington inflated the numbers. Rumor put the band at 150 warriors when the actual count was closer to 30. The inflation was partly fear and partly politics. A quarter of the standing army failing to catch 30 people was a story that needed a larger enemy to be narratively survivable. By August, Miles had reached a conclusion his pride resisted, but his situation demanded. Force alone would not end this. The only person who could bring Geronimo in was someone he would agree to meet, and the only person he would agree to meet was Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, one of Crook's officers, a man Geronimo had dealt with honestly across years of reservation life, who spoke enough Apache to be understood without an interpreter standing between them. Miles disliked Gatewood. He had no one else. Gatewood was ill. His joints were bad, and the campaign in Mexico would be punishing. He told Miles the mission sounded like a fool's errand. Miles assigned him anyway. Gatewood took 2 Apache scouts, Quillita and Martin, both Chiricahua men with connections to Geronimo's band, and rode south into Mexico without a large escort, without fanfare, and without a plan beyond finding a man that 5,000 soldiers had spent 5 months failing to locate. He found him. In the last days of August 1886, Gatewood located Geronimo's camp deep in the mountains of Sonora. He rode in with his 2 scouts and no protective force, the same way Tom Jeffords had once ridden into Cochise's stronghold, with nothing but the fact of his arrival to protect him. Geronimo came out to meet him. They sat in the shade of a tree and talked. Gatewood carried one piece of information that changed everything. He told Geronimo that the Chiricahua remaining on the reservation, every family, every elder, every child, every warrior who had stayed behind, including the scouts who had served the army loyally and helped produce this very moment, had been loaded onto trains and shipped to Florida as prisoners of war. There was no reservation to return to. The people Geronimo had been fighting to protect were already gone. Geronimo sat with that for a moment. Then he asked what Miles was offering. Gatewood told him no guarantees. A meeting with Miles. A conversation about terms. It was almost nothing. But the alternative, continuing to run with 38 people, no home, no reservation, no destination, with the entire apparatus of 2 nations deployed against them, had its own arithmetic. Geronimo said he would meet Miles. The meeting took place at Skeleton Canyon on September 4, 1886. Geronimo rode in on horseback. Miles was waiting with his officers and an escort. The 2 men sat across from each other, and Miles told Geronimo that his people would be sent to Florida to be reunited with their families, held for 2 years, and then returned to a reservation in the Southwest. Geronimo accepted the terms. He handed over his rifle. He shook Miles's hand. He was the last armed and mounted Native American leader in the United States to formally surrender to the military. Around him were 27 followers. Behind him were 35 years of war, the Llanos Massacre, the hills above Apache Pass, the Dragoon Mountains, the Sierra Madre, the breakouts and returns, 5,000 soldiers and the 30 heliograph stations and the quarter of the American Army deployed against fewer people than could fill a single passenger rail car. Within hours, the terms began to come apart. Miles had promised that Geronimo's family would accompany him to Florida. The train that left Arizona carried Geronimo and his warriors, but did not stop to collect their families. The families, already prisoners in Florida, would remain separated from the men for months. The terms were broken before the train crossed the state line. Miles later claimed he had never promised what Geronimo believed he had promised. There is no definitive record that resolves the dispute. What is definitive is the outcome. The terms Geronimo accepted on September 4th were not the terms he experienced on September 5th or any day after. The pattern that had governed every major interaction between the United States and the Apache since February of 1861 had repeated itself one final time. A promise was made. The promise did not survive contact with what the government actually intended to do. The Apache scouts who had served under Crook, the men who had tracked Geronimo through the Sierra Madre, who had made Crook's strategy work, who had at personal cost hunted men who were sometimes their own kin, were placed on the same trains as the warriors they had hunted. They were sent to the same prisons. They were held under the same conditions. The United States government made no distinction between those who had resisted and those who had served it faithfully. They were all Chiricahua Apache. They were all removed. General Crook learned what had happened to his scouts from newspaper reports. He had left Arizona believing that the men who had served him would be protected, their service acknowledged. When he understood what Miles had done, he wrote to his superiors in terms that left nothing ambiguous. He called it a breach of faith so severe that no Apache could be expected to trust the word of the United States government again. He was right. He was ignored. In Washington, the end of the Apache Wars was celebrated. General Miles was decorated. The campaign was written into the official record as a military success. The heroic pursuit and capture of the last hostile Apache, the pacification of the Southwest, the end of the American Indian Wars. The story was straightforward and satisfying and bore a specific relationship to what had actually happened. 5,000 soldiers had spent 5 months failing to find 38 people, and the man who finally reached Geronimo had done it with 2 scouts and no weapons, the same way Jeffords had reached Cochise 20 years earlier. What the military record calls a victory is not wrong, exactly. The Apache Wars did end, Geronimo did surrender. The Southwest was governed from that point without organized armed resistance from the Chiricahua Apache. Those are facts. What surrounds them is also fact. The scouts betrayed, the terms broken, the families separated, the reservation promised and never delivered. The people counted as prisoners of war and shipped across the continent to die in Florida. The victory was real. The cost of it was paid by people whose names the official record largely does not preserve. What Geronimo said when he handed over his rifle to Miles at Skeleton Canyon has been recorded in several versions. The most consistent account holds that he said something to the effect that this was the 4th time he had surrendered, and he thought it was the last. It was a statement precise enough to contain its own weight, the last surrender of the American Indian Wars, delivered by the man who had embodied that resistance until nothing else remained, expressed as an arithmetic observation. 4 surrenders, this one was the last. He was 57 years old. He had been at war intermittently for 35 years. He had watched Mongas Coloradas trust a white flag and be murdered for it. He had watched Cochise build a peace and die 2 years before it was destroyed. He had trusted Crook and come back from Mexico and watched the terms produce a new set of reasons to leave. He had trusted Miles at Skeleton Canyon. The train was already loaded before he asked where it was going. He was Goyakla. He was a medicine man and a father and a husband and a warrior who had survived everything the Southwest could produce: heat, drought, Mexican cavalry, American cavalry, Apache scouts deployed against him by the same government that imprisoned him, 5 breakouts and 4 surrenders and 35 years of being the last man still moving in a war that kept outlasting the people it was supposed to end. Now the train was moving east. The desert outside the window was getting smaller. He watched it until it was gone. The war that had started with a lieutenant's blunder at Apache Pass in 1861, with a tent and a knife and a family taken hostage over a kidnapping that Cochise had nothing to do with, ended in a canyon in southern Arizona with a handshake and a set of terms that would be broken within days. 25 years. Every escalation traceable to a broken promise. Every leader who walked forward in trust punished for it. And, at the end of it, a man on a train watching the mountains disappear, carrying with him the knowledge that he had been right about everything except whether it would be enough. The train left Arizona on September 8, 1886. Geronimo sat in a rail car with his warriors, watching the desert he had defended for 30 years pass through a window he could not open. He had been told they were going to Florida. He had been told his family would be there. He had been told the arrangement would last 2 years, after which the Chiricahua would be given a reservation in the Southwest. 3 of those 4 things were true. They were going to Florida. His family was not there yet. There would be no reservation in the Southwest. Not in 2 years, not ever. When the train pulled into Pensacola on the morning of October 25th, a crowd of 2,000 people was waiting at the wharf. They had come to see the famous prisoner. The Apache warriors stepped onto the docks into the humid Gulf air. Men from the high desert of the Sierra Madre, men who had slept in the mountains and lived on what the land offered, and entered a world that bore no resemblance to anything they had ever known. The army separated them immediately. Geronimo and 15 other warriors were taken to Fort Pickens, an old Civil War fortification on a barrier island in Pensacola Bay. Their families, wives, children, elderly, were sent 300 miles east to Fort Marion in St. Augustine. The separation was not accidental, it was deliberate. General Miles had promised Geronimo that his people would not be divided. The promise was broken before the first week was out. At Fort Pickens, the men worked 7 hours a day. They cleared weeds, they stacked cannonballs. They repaired the deteriorating walls of a fort that had been largely empty since the Civil War. Within weeks, the Army began charging admission to see them. 50 cents for adults, 25 cents for children. On a single Sunday in early 1887, 459 tourists came to stare at the men who had held off the United States Army for a quarter of a century. The editorial in the local newspaper had predicted it. Geronimo would be an attraction that would bring a great many visitors. The families were not reunited until May of 1887, 7 months after the surrender. During those 7 months, several wives and children had died at Fort Marion, where the low, wet climate of the Florida coast delivered diseases the high-altitude Apache had no resistance to. Malaria took people quietly and continuously. One of Geronimo's wives was buried in a cemetery in Pensacola, in Florida soil far from any mountain she had known. In 1888, the Army moved the entire group to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, citing a yellow fever scare in Florida. Alabama was not the Southwest either. It was humid, forested, and equally foreign. The children were separated from their parents and sent to boarding schools in Pennsylvania where they were required to abandon Apache language, Apache names, and Apache belief. They were taught English, Christianity, and the practical skills of settled agricultural life. Tuberculosis moved through those schools methodically. Many of the children who were sent east did not come back. By 1894, the Chiricahua who remained were moved a final time to Fort Sill in Oklahoma Territory, on land that had belonged to the Comanche and Kiowa. They were given 50,000 acres and permitted to build homes and farm. They were still prisoners of war. The designation was not a formality. It meant they could not leave without permission. It meant their movements were subject to military approval. It meant that the land they farmed was not theirs and could be taken again without notice. Geronimo farmed. He planted watermelons and sold them from a cart. He joined the Dutch Reformed Church, though the congregation eventually asked him to leave because he could not give up gambling. He was photographed in a car in 1904. He was photographed in a suit. He was photographed holding a bough with tourists standing beside him, grinning at the St. Louis World's Fair, where he had been presented as a living monument to the progress of civilization, displayed in an Apache village exhibit on the Midway, making bows and arrows while Pueblo women nearby pounded corn and made pottery for the watching crowd. He understood what was happening. He had always been perceptive about how his enemies thought. He began to sell his own image, autographs, photographs, buttons from his shirt that visitors tried to take as souvenirs. He bought replacement buttons at train stops, sewed them back on, and sold them again at the next station. He understood commerce the way he had once understood terrain, as a system with rules you could learn and use. He made money. He remained a prisoner at the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, at the Omaha Exposition in 1898, at Wild West shows across the country, where he was billed alongside Buffalo Bill Cody and Pawnee Bill and presented as the last great warrior of the vanishing frontier. Audiences cheered. The man they were cheering for could not go home. In 1905, Geronimo rode in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in Washington. He sat on a horse in a procession that also included Quanah Parker of the Comanche, Buckskin Charlie of the Ute, and Hollow Horn Bear of the Brule Sioux, a parade of subjugated peoples marshaled for a president's ceremony, presented to the crowd as evidence that the American frontier had been settled. The crowd shouted his name. He heard it. He rode on. 5 days after the parade, Geronimo met Roosevelt privately. He had requested the audience specifically, and he had prepared what he wanted to say. He told the president that he and his people had been prisoners for nearly 20 years. He said that the old men among them wanted only to die in the land where they had been born. He said, "I pray you to cut the ropes and make me free. Let me die in my own country, an old man who has been punished enough." Roosevelt listened. Then he refused. He said there would be more trouble if the Apache returned west, and that he was sorry, and that he had no feelings against Geronimo personally. Geronimo left the room still a prisoner. The years at Fort Sill diminished the Chiricahua in numbers that are precise and documented. When Geronimo surrendered in 1886, the Chiricahua who were taken as prisoners, including the peaceful families who had stayed on the reservation the entire time, including the Apache scouts who had helped the Army find him, numbered approximately 500. By 1913, when the United States government finally lifted their prisoner of war designation, 261 remained. More than half of the people who had been imprisoned in 1886 were dead. The scouts deserve a particular note. The Apache men who had served under Crook, who had tracked Geronimo through the Sierra Madre, who had helped bring about the surrender, were loaded onto the same trains as the warriors they had hunted and sent to the same prisons and held under the same conditions. The government made no distinction between those who had resisted and those who had served it. They were all Apache. They were all removed. It was the final confirmation of something Geronimo had understood since 1861. The nature of the arrangement between the United States and the Apache was not governed by behavior. It was governed by what you were. In February of 1909, Geronimo was riding alone near Fort Sill at night when his horse threw him. He lay on the cold ground until morning, when a friend found him and carried him in. His body, 79 years old and long removed from the desert that had forged it, could not withstand the night. He fell ill. 6 days later, he was gone. He asked for his nephew at the end. His nephew came and sat beside him. In the last hours, Geronimo told him, "I should never have surrendered. I should have kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight with." Then he died. It was February 17, 1909. He had been a prisoner of war for 23 years. He was buried at Fort Sill in the Apache Indian Prisoner of War Cemetery. His grave is there today. He never went home. The Chiricahua Apache remaining at Fort Sill were released from prisoner of war status in 1913. 27 years after the surrender. Of the 500 who had been imprisoned, 261 walked free. 1/3 chose to remain at Fort Sill, where their dead were buried and where some semblance of a life had been built over a generation of captivity. 2/3 traveled to the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. It was not home. It was the closest available thing. The Apache Wars, the American Indian Wars that began with a lieutenant's blunder at Apache Pass in 1861 and ended with a man falling from a horse in Oklahoma in 1909, lasted, from first shot to last breath, 48 years. The United States Army never defeated Geronimo in the field. It outlasted him. It exhausted his people, took his family, closed every road home, and waited. The waiting worked. The military campaign had not. There is a version of this story told in American history that ends with the West being won, with progress, settlement, and civilization pushing through a wilderness to build a nation. Geronimo does not fit that story cleanly, which is perhaps why his name became a war cry, a brand, a parachuting shout. Something loud and brief that could hold the feeling of his legend without requiring anyone to look too closely at what the legend was actually about. What it was about was this: a man who watched every peace offering be refused, every treaty be broken, and every leader who walked forward in trust be punished for it, and who concluded, from the evidence available to him, that the only rational response was to keep moving. He was right about the evidence. The evidence never changed. The only thing that changed was that eventually there was nowhere left to move to, and the people he was moving with were too few and too tired to continue, and the one thing he could not protect them from was time. He is buried at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the mountains of southeastern Arizona, the Chiricahua, the Dragoon, the country where Cochise built his stronghold and where the war that defined the American Indian Wars began, stand empty of the people who held them. The land that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred from Mexico to the United States in 1848, the land that Cochise refused to leave, and Geronimo refused to leave, and the whole machinery of the American military spent a generation trying to take, is now part of the state of Arizona. The Apache were never consulted about any of it. They were never defeated. They were simply outlasted and imprisoned and reduced until there were not enough of them left to matter to the people making the decisions. He should have never surrendered. He was probably right about that too, but he was old and his people were gone, and the man across the table told him there was somewhere safe to go. He believed him. It was the only lie he ever fell for that he could not walk away from. He kept it until the end. The last armed and mounted Native American leader to formally surrender to the United States military died in the cold on the ground in Oklahoma, 30 miles from the nearest mountain, still waiting to go home. That is how the American Indian Wars ended, not with a battle, not with a treaty, with a man and a horse and a night too cold for a body that had survived everything else, with a nephew at a bedside, with 7 words spoken in the dark to someone who would remember them. I should never have surrendered. I should have kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. He was Goyakla. He was a medicine man and a father and a husband. He was born in the mountains that Mexico claimed and America took, and neither of them ever truly held. He learned to fight the way the land taught him, without fixed lines, without surrender, until there was nothing left, without the belief that an enemy who had already lied to you twice would tell you the truth the 3rd time. He was right about almost everything. He could not outrun time. Nobody can. The Apache still exist. The Chiricahua Apache, descendants of the people imprisoned at Fort Sill and scattered to New Mexico, live in both places today. The Fort Sill Apache tribe of Oklahoma, the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. They have never stopped calling for the return of their ancestral lands. They have never been given them. The mountains are still there. The people are still there. Elsewhere. The distance between those two facts is what the Apache Wars left behind. His name is on aircraft and operations, and the shout soldiers use when they jump into the unknown. None of that is what he was. What he was is in the record, if you read it carefully. A man who understood exactly what was being done to his people, who fought it with every tool available to him for longer than most nations sustain any war, and who died in captivity, still trying to go home. The word people shout when they jump is not about courage, it is about falling. They just forgot which direction. The American Indian Wars ended, the land was taken, the people remained. And somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains of southeastern Arizona, in a hidden place that only his people know, Cochise is still buried. No marker, no monument. Just the mountains and the secret and the rock that General Howard placed on a mesa in 1872 as a symbol of the peace that would last as long as the stone endured. The stone is still there. The peace did not last 2 years. He walked into a tent in good faith. He walked out through the wall with a knife. He fought for 25 years. He surrendered once and trusted the terms and was betrayed. He surrendered a second time and trusted the terms and was betrayed again. He held his people together in the mountains of Mexico, with 5,000 soldiers in the field against him, and he never lost a battle he chose to fight. He died as a prisoner of war. He is buried in Oklahoma. He asked to go home. They said no. His name was Geronimo. That is the story the American Indian Wars left behind. Not a conquest, a wait, not a defeat. A slow, patient, institutional removal of everything that made resistance possible. The land, the water, the food, the children, the language, the dead. Until there was nothing left to hold on to except the memory of what it had been. Geronimo held on to that until his last breath. He never let it go. He just ran out of time. The Apache are still here. Remember that. Every account of the Apache Wars that ends with Geronimo's surrender as the conclusion of a story is missing the last chapter. The last chapter is still being written. The people who were called the enemy of civilization, the obstacle to progress, the bloodthirsty savages of 100 years of American mythology, they are still here, on the land that remains to them, with the language still alive in the mouths of their children. That is the real end of the Apache Wars, not a grave in Oklahoma, not a treaty never honored, a people who could not be finished because they refused to be. Geronimo refused too. He refused until the last moment he had left, and when that moment was gone, he spoke the truth of it to the one person sitting with him in the dark. The mountains were still out there. He could feel them from where he lay. He never stopped facing that direction. He never stopped being from there. He was Goyakla, the one who yawns, and the name the world knew him by was the sound of his enemies calling out to God when they saw him coming, because they had no better answer for what he was. He was the last, he was not the end. And if you have spent this time with him, with Cochise and Mangas Coloradas and the 16 days at Apache Pass and the Dragoon Mountains and the Sierra Madre and the trains to Florida and the cold ground in Oklahoma, then you know something now that most people do not. You know that the American Indian Wars did not produce a winner. They produced a record, and the record says they came in good faith and were answered with bad faith, and they fought back with everything they had, and they were not defeated. They were simply not allowed to win. That is the Apache Wars. That is Geronimo. That is the last war of the American Indian Wars that America has never quite finished reckoning with. The man who yawned when he was born and became the name his enemies screamed at him in battle and died, asking to go home, is buried in Oklahoma, still a prisoner on the map, still pointing west toward mountains that are still there, waiting for a people that never stopped existing. His name was Geronimo. Now you know what it means. Remember it.